College football nerds, last preview of the 2019 season. We are talking Clemson. We are talking LSU. That sounded like a little bit of a Z, but I'm going to say Clemson as much as I can throughout this video. Can't make fun of Josh for how he says anything. He is sick, but he is here with me doing this show. Going to remind y'all, if you haven't already, even you Clemson fans, like and subscribe. Please, it helps us out a ton. And we always promise, but we are going to do off-season content, a little more storytelling this year, a little more interesting pieces this year, and probably going to try to get something out, draft coverage as well. Also, we have an audio version of this. Going to remind you, iTunes, Android, check it out. It'll be there about the same time as the video, maybe a little bit later. Okay, Josh, we talked, I believe it was in the LSU Oklahoma review, about how we wanted to see how the bowl games played out. Not necessarily because we're like, oh, SEC went 7-2 and you're, whatever your record was, not great. We didn't, not from that standpoint, but sort of from a more granular standpoint, especially with Baylor and Georgia. We wanted to use that as kind of a benchmark and a potential leading indicator of how to view in context the LSU and Oklahoma game. And we talked a lot about conference isolation, how conferences don't play other conferences, Power 5 conferences, out of conference. And it's left us with a dearth of data to know how strong a conference is. And there was some concern that the Big 12 was, in general, just overrated and that possibly Oklahoma just wasn't that good this year. And we thought, okay, what you actually said was, if I'm an LSU fan, I want to see Georgia struggle with Baylor. And Georgia was out even more players, still beat Baylor pretty comfortably. And I want you to talk about that in terms of maybe what that game told you, and broader, how we have a challenge when it comes to numbers, in this case, in Clemson's favor for actually playing a better opponent, and LSU throughout the course of this season playing better opponents. How that gives us a hard time with the numbers, and maybe where we're going to have to pivot to learn a thing or two about how we could predict this game.
The point I was trying to make with the situation with Baylor and Georgia and Oklahoma is that you really wanted to think that Oklahoma was a good opponent. And the most sort of challenging thing in evaluating these two games with Clemson and LSU is that I think Clemson played easily one of the top teams in the country. I'm not really sure Oklahoma did. LSU did. I'm not sure Oklahoma was one such team. And the point we were making with Baylor was just, hey, LSU handled Georgia pretty readily. And if LSU beat a Georgia team that wasn't as good as Baylor, and Oklahoma beat Baylor, and then LSU thumped Oklahoma, then you feel like they were improving it even more. The problem with Georgia handling Baylor fairly comfortably is it all fits into the narrative that Oklahoma just wasn't very good. And we'd flagged going into bowl season, the Big 12 had only played two Power 5 teams outside their own conference with a winning record. They were 0-2 in those two games, one of whom was Texas over LSU, or Texas against LSU in a close game. One, we'd flagged all year that Texas, we had them high in our rankings, which people kind of mocked. And I know people like making fun of Texas, but we'd flagged the fact that, hey, you have to understand how many people were hurt. You can't lose people like Stearns, who's an All-American, first-team All-American safety, or should have been, and not have a tremendous fall off, especially given they were already replacing a lot of guys. And we saw that against Utah. I mean, they look like a different team in that game. Outside them, who really weren't really ever right for most of the season in the Big 12, I think the Big 12 just wasn't very good. And that's not a thing that's a negative on LSU. It just makes it that much more difficult to evaluate. On the flip side, Clemson against Ohio State played, what we often had the number one team. You had Clemson to win. I had Ohio State to win. I'll say we were both in the 20s. The model was in the 20s, had Clemson by half a point. We were kind of all over that game. And if you want to, when I give it back to you, you can spin that a little bit and talk about how close we really were. I know we said that in the review video, but the way it could shake out. But the point is, I think there are things that you can take away from Clemson against Ohio State because it's a more meaningful game. I also think you have to be very careful in taking things away from the Ohio State game because Ohio State can expose you in a way that, frankly, no other team in college football probably can. They are better in certain ways than any other team in college football. So some of the statistics you get from that game aren't really useful because they're too good, and good in a way that other teams can't give you that breaking point, whereas LSU didn't really get any competition with Oklahoma. Now, over the course of the season, those statistics aren't really useful either because LSU did play radically harder competition across all 13 weeks of the season, whereas Clemson didn't play anywhere, or 14 weeks, I guess I should say, and then Clemson, had that one data point with Ohio State. But what I think is also very clear is that Clemson was capable of being played with by a team that was a really high-level team. They are an elite team, but the rest of the data points didn't really show anything because, one of the things we pointed to leading into this game was the fact that Travis Etienne, as a pure runner, had not been very successful in these big games. And he had, maybe his best rushing season of his career, and sure enough, he had 3.6 yards per carry against Ohio State, despite all the season-long statistics indicating that we dominate in this game and have over, our model had him over 4 yards per carry, and we were correct in thinking that was probably going to be wrong, again, as a runner, not as a receiver. That's the kind of stuff that's difficult in both teams. I don't think you can take either one of these single data point games and make much out of it because Clemson's was so much harder. And I also don't think you can use season statistics. The one thing you can do, though, is look at the games, look at things like where Etienne struggled against Ohio State, look at where they were successful, and pick out strengths and weaknesses versus elite teams. And get just sort of an idea of what the matchups look like and where the strengths are. And then once you have an idea of what the picture is for these two teams, then you can look at those puzzle pieces and say, how do they fit together? And how is that likely to impact the game, knowing where the strengths and weaknesses are and how they work in matchups?
So that's a little bit of foreshadowing for, I think, Clemson fans and LSU fans are familiar with what we did in the semifinals, in that we did unit versus unit rankings, and we're going to have that discussion in this one as well, and probably spend a little more time there than we do on the model because the numbers are so hard to compare. But to your point, and I'm happy to take a victory lap on this, the model had the Clemson-Ohio State game 27-28 for Clemson. The game was 29-23. I had 21-26. So 6-point margin versus my predicted 5-point margin. If Ohio State would have scored on the play where receiver broke off and Clemson ended up getting the interception end zone, if they'd have scored on that play, it would have been 30-29, and you picked 31-28. So, to your point, we were all over this game, and that's what we always talk about when it's a one-score game. One play can change anything, but the model, you had it and I had it, all in that mid to upper 20s sort of space, and that's where it ended up. And it's tough because we didn't really know what to expect out of Clemson. We didn't know what to expect from Ohio State versus an elite passing attack because they hadn't really seen one all year. But I think it's fair because Clemson fans have mentioned this in our review comments. I think it's a fair point when they bring up the fact that Higgins was out for most of the game. Ross was not. He was obviously struggling in that game as well. So they sort of benefited in a way that I don't think LSU will from a healthy opposition. Talk to me a little bit about you said we can't hold it against LSU and it's fair. We've said the same thing for Clemson. We can't hold it against you if your opponent is not very good and you smoke them. We can hold it against you if you struggle, but we can't hold it against you if you just go out and murder them. And LSU murdered them in a way that I don't think people fully understand. And we talked about this in our review. 9 touchdowns on 11 possessions, and one of those possessions was a missed field goal. That's unbelievable. So talk to me a little bit about what you did see versus Oklahoma, or if there was anything you could take away from that game versus Oklahoma that you saw from LSU that maybe you didn't see throughout the regular season, either good or bad.
I think the biggest thing when you evaluate LSU is trying to figure out where you think Oklahoma is. And we kind of led with this point, right? That Oklahoma, I think they're a good team. I don't think they were nearly what they were made out to be. And, I think in terms of pure stats, maybe it's not as useful. But I think one of the things you can look at is how LSU did relative to other teams that played Oklahoma. And you can look at the consistency and efficiency with which they operated. So the first thing I would point out in terms of pass defense and run defense, it wasn't necessarily unheard of to shut down Jalen Hurts in the passing game. 6.6 yards per attempt against LSU. Against TCU, they were 6.9. Against Baylor in the first game, they were 6.9 yards per attempt. They were 12 later. but they were focused more on the run in the later game. The point being that teams had shut down Oklahoma to a similar extent. Now, when they shut them down, though, you're looking at like the Baylor defense, and I think most people would agree that Baylor is a very good defense. And even in the Georgia game, I don't think the defense looked horrid by any means. And if that's where LSU is, as a lot of people see them as this, quote, bad defense, and we've pushed against that narrative, they're not bad. They're actually quite good. They haven't necessarily been top 5, top 10 elite. They kind of have the same problem that down the stretch that Alabama had in that regard. And I think both teams, they kind of got an overreaction because they probably are really top 10 overall defenses. But they're, maybe they are comparable to Baylor. And along the same line, in the last Baylor game, I said they were focused more on stopping the run. Baylor held Oklahoma to under 3 yards a carry, 2.9 yards per carry. They were, again, the first game, 4.4. I think the notable thing, though, in these examples is no one had ever succeeded at stopping Oklahoma in the run and the pass in the same game. Baylor, in their last game, gave up 12 yards per attempt and 2.9 yards per carry. In the first game, they gave up 4.4 yards per carry, which was a good bit higher, but they held them to 6.9 yards per attempt. What LSU just did was 6.6 yards per attempt, a lower mark, and 3.4 yards per carry. So you held them low to both ends, and nobody had done that. And I think Oklahoma's offense is very good, and I think it's hard to defend because they're such a power run team with a vertical passing component. It's hard to defend them, in both respects. It's also notable they have to play against CeeDee Lamb, who was not always there for Oklahoma. So I think the biggest positive I would take from LSU is I think they are a complete defense, and I think the defense was complete in their ability to handle Oklahoma straight up without having to compensate for something or overcorrect. Nobody else was really able to do that throughout the season. Something we predicted was that LSU's corners were good enough that they would actually be able to match up man-to-man, unlike CeeDee Lamb and Rambo. I think we saw that play out. It wasn't that Lamb wouldn't get his, which we said Lamb's going to get his yardage. He's going to get 100 yards receiving. He did get 100 yards receiving, but he's not going to get 250, which is what they kind of needed to win the game. And then the quick point I'll make on the other side, and I'll repeat something for a review video and not belabor the point, the efficiency with which they scored is obscene. It's very hard to do what they did in the first half where you score 49 points, which is 7 touchdowns, and you do it in 8 possessions. 7 out of 8 possessions and a half. And we made the point that there was a game that put Lamar Jackson on the map where he won 62-28, I believe. And it was against Syracuse, and he scored 5 touchdowns in the first half, and everybody came in at gaga. Well, he scored 5 touchdowns, and they actually had 11 possessions. Both teams ran hurry-up tempo, and he got the ball a ton. So to sort of put it in perspective, Lamar Jackson's breakout game is 5-11, and Burrow did 7-8. Oklahoma was actually trying to slow the game down heavily in the second half, as was LSU a little bit, because they were trying not to end up being any more of a blowout than it was. That offensive production was so good. I almost can't comment more on it. Particularly in the passing game, it was pretty much whatever they wanted. 13 yards a carry is obscene, or per attempt, I should say. The only maybe slight negative is they were like 5 to 7 yards per carry. They weren't necessarily destroying Oklahoma on the ground, but they also did that with Edwards-Helaire only getting 2 carries, and they managed to keep him healthy.
So you did LSU, I'll do Clemson. For us, we felt pretty good about what we knew and didn't know about this team in terms of individual players. We weren't shocked that Trevor Lawrence could run the ball. We knew he could run it, not maybe a 67-yarder like that, but we flagged that Etienne was going to struggle running the ball, and he did. Clemson fans are going to get at us on that, but he did. And he's consistently struggled running the ball, but the fact that they found ways to get him the ball, get him involved outside of that was great. For me and for both of us going into this game was the question mark of who is Clemson outside of beating a bunch of tomato cans? And that might be the first tomato can of this season. Saved it for this one. Who are they? And I think that was a fair question. Clemson fans are going to say, well, 44-16 and 29 in a row, none of that matters. What matters is what you've done this year. And what you've done this year is replace a whole bunch of incumbent talent on the defensive side of the ball and play a bunch of nobodies. So we didn't know. What I liked seeing the most out of Clemson in this game was, one, I do think Ohio State jumped on them a little bit early, but they adjusted quickly and they didn't let the game, become too big for them. They didn't get the shock of playing an elite team. It didn't overwhelm them. And I think they were getting out-coached early, and then they out-coached Ohio State late. They made adjustments at halftime. They made adjustments in the second quarter. And over the course of the game, those adjustments sort of showed us who Clemson is as a team and not as a bunch of individuals. And my main takeaway from that is there is not going to be a team that they can't match up with. There's not going to be a team that this is going to out-physical them, or that the stage is going to be too big for them, in spite of not having these big games to test them all year. LSU fans coming in, they're going to say, we're battle-tested, and we've been in these slugfests. We've been in these back and forths, and you've only been in one. I saw enough in that one to know that I don't have any concerns for them in this game either, at least in terms of meeting whatever LSU brings to the table.
I would agree with that point, and I would agree that Clemson really, I think, showed that they deserve to be on that stage without a doubt, right? I mean, they obviously won the game. There were some things that went back and forth. We talked about the penalties in the review videos because everybody's going to be obsessed about them. Let's put that aside here. It doesn't really matter at this point. What did matter is that Clemson was able to go blow for blow. I mean, Clemson had a higher yard per attempt average than Ohio State. They had a higher yard per carry average. And we are per play channel, more or less, just in terms of the fact that we often say, per play stats are somewhat useful and matter. Total yardage stats often don't. Notably in this game, Ohio State had higher yardage marks. I mean, if you just look at the total stats, you say, oh, well, they outgained Clemson by 100 yards. They outgained them purely because they ran more plays, which is a function of field position and a lot of other things. It's actually kind of weird with the turnover margin, but that also kind of explains it as well, that Ohio State had 2 drives where they got yards and then sort of threw them away. But, in a per-play sense, Clemson outplayed Ohio State. I mean, they did. They had higher averages than Ohio State did. And that sort of indicates that, yes, they did win. I know Bill Connolly's metrics said that Clemson had like a 66% winning percentage, or win expectancy, I should say, with the various things that happened in the game. Now, that does actually take into account the turnovers. It's not like 66% in spite of them. The thing that I would push back on a little bit, and this is maybe turning more into the analytical side of this, is trying to figure out where these two teams are from a consistency standpoint. And I already touched on the fact that LSU was extremely consistent in the game against Oklahoma, and their offense has been consistent throughout the season. I mean, they had one game where they had low scoring. It was against Auburn. That was a game where they also had over 500 yards of offense. A lot of weird stuff happened in the red zone. I think you can call that a one-off one-off game where everybody has an off night. And even in their off night to put up yards, they just managed to kind of screw up scoring points in that one particular game. Clemson was very feast or famine. And we've already talked about that in the review video, but I'll sort of repeat it. Etienne had his couple long receptions. Trevor Lawrence had a 67-yard carry. I think some people are going to make too much of Lawrence as a runner going into this game against LSU. I think that's a little bit of a mistake. I think Lawrence can be a very effective runner, but there's effective to get you to 29 and there's effective to get you to 40. And one of the big discussions here has to be, is this a game that's scored in the 35 to 45 point range? Because Lawrence had a 67-yard carry that did sort of win the game for Clemson in this game, where they needed to score less than 30 to win. But outside that, he had 40 yards and 15 carries, which is, 40 yards less than 15 carries, you're less than 3 yards per carry, right? So you're not really, he had a couple carries really in the game. There's sacks that factor into it, which is annoying with college stats, and I have no way to fix that. But he really wasn't a play-to-play effective runner. And Etienne wasn't an effective runner. And even the receiving game was not consistently effective. It was effective in big plays, which has been their mantra, but they were just over 50% passing. So the takeaway from all that, what I'm saying, is they hit on a handful of chunk plays that got them to 29 points. I'm not sure how well that's going to work if they're in a situation where LSU scores a lot more. And that's really the question. And I think, one, you can comment on that. And then two, I think the second point, and this is related to Fields as a 0.9 yard per carry guy in the Clemson game, was how the quarterbacks play into it, and the challenge playing LSU with how Burrow is as a passer and how these quarterbacks all operate.
And this is something that I tweeted about, half joking, half serious. I said, it feels to me like Clemson is either going to go 3 and out or score a touchdown, and nothing in between. And that was our concern even going into this game, relative to what happened against Alabama last year, they had a lot of success against Alabama with huge chunk plays, bombs away, but that is far less repeatable than the team that can get 7 yards a clip, that can stay on the field. One, it keeps your defense on the sidelines, and two, it's a lot more repeatable. To be able to stay on the field and not have to count on 67-yard runs from your quarterback who's not had to run longer than 20 yards all season. That's what concerns me about this game. And I'm not ready to pick, and I'm not saying Clemson's going to lose, but if I'm saying something that might tip the scales in LSU's favor, it's the fact that they do have an offense that does have, in my opinion, a good bit better intermediate passing game and relies less on superhero throws, even though Burrow makes them, and seems to cater more towards moving the chains and keeping their offense on the field. I am concerned with that a little bit. The quarterback situation, it is interesting because I thought Fields was a good passer in this game, just not an elite passer, and that may have been all the difference in the world. People want to talk about the drops that Dobbins had. One of those was not a great throw, and when you're throwing a running back, they got to be right there. But in general, I felt like it was half and half. I really like the fact that, the results speak for themselves. Clemson's red zone defense. Venables gets you in the red zone. You're not scoring touchdowns. Some of that was because of Ohio State miscues. I think that is completely fair to mention. But some of it was because Clemson changed the game up a little bit when they got down there, and it forced Fields to make bad throws or bad reads or whatever. And that's what Clemson does. That's why they're an elite team. I do wonder, though, if you give LSU 4 red zone trips in the first half and you get one red zone trip in the first half, I don't think they're coming away 16-7. I just don't. So that's a concern for me as well. But on the flip side, I do think they adjusted a good bit later on, and maybe some of that was just the shock of actually playing a team that can match them athlete for athlete, and they hadn't seen that all year. We can talk this to death. I want to talk about unit versus unit stuff in a minute. Why don't you, before we get into that, kind of run us through the numbers real quick, even though we said that they're not a great indicator in this game. Run us through the numbers and talk about maybe if there's anything interesting that you did glean from that, or if there's nothing at all.
I don't think the model is super useful in this particular game, but I do think at least, just as we say, setting a baseline, it's somewhat interesting. We often talk about percentage of opponent averages allowed, so you talk about defensive statistics. The first thing I want to note is that LSU is not really all as far off from Clemson as people might think. LSU was 78% of opponent rushing averages. Clemson was 74%. The rush defenses are actually pretty similar. Now, even with that, there's a little bit of an asterisk. We account for competition level relative to like your opponent's averages and how well they do yard per carry and that stuff. But we can't quite account for the fact that you are siloed. So what I mean by that is it's one thing to play bad teams. With a bad set, like if Alabama plays the bad part of the SEC like they did this year, our model can really account for that part. It can't account for playing in a bad conference, which was, and I'll say our model, we hyped it up on the Clemson game. It wasn't great in Oklahoma LSU, but we flagged the fact that we didn't think, I think it had like a 7-point game, and neither one of us bought that. And it was because the Big 12 played against the Big 12. Their averages were averages generated against the Big 12. It's not very useful to compare those averages versus defensive statistics generated in the SEC or the Big 10, maybe even the ACC, given where the Big 12 is this year. So those numbers are similar, but bear in mind, largely different, mostly based on different competition. Passing averages 87% for LSU, 72% for Clemson. That 72% number is truly elite. Anything under 75% is very hard to attain. 87% is still good, mind you, and that's still going to be one of the better pass defenses Clemson's faced, just not as good as, I would say, Ohio State's overall. The reason, I think, is not the secondary nearly as much as it is the fact that Ohio State is a much better pass rushing team than LSU. The predictions from that, I think it's kind of interesting in that LSU is predicted to be outgained by Clemson in a per-play basis, but is actually expected to win. So LSU is expected to have 5.9 yards per play, about 3.7 yards per carry, 7.6 yards per attempt. Again, we say this all the time. past couple of years, LSU has not been an overly good run team. They're solid, but they're not great. Clemson's expected to be a lot more successful in the run in this game. I don't think that's shocking. LSU's had a couple off days, and Clemson is very potent in the run game. I think that's going to come in bursts, by the way. I don't think it's going to be consistent yardage. About the same passing yardage, though, and about 6.1 yards per play. So 5.9, 6.1, about the same per play total. The difference is that LSU is just more efficient, especially in that kind of yardage range, which is not particularly high. LSU is still expected to get 39 points. They do a very good job of scoring if they can get any sort of consistent production. And that, I think, is really a virtue of Burrow. And Burrow versus Lawrence. So Lawrence is a big play quarterback. He hits big shots. Clemson already said that yard per carry total, I would expect it to be, something like it was in the Ohio State game where you look at it and you go, okay, it's like 4 yards per carry. But the truth is the vast majority of the carries were ineffective carries. The efficiency numbers are low. The explosive numbers are high. They probably get 1 or 2 big plays from Etienne, but not a lot of efficiency. LSU's yardage is probably going to be a lot more efficient. In particular, their ability, I think, to convert on third downs is a lot better, and that's how it turns out. And do you mind if I make my little point about quarterbacks before I turn it back over to you? So I have this point I wanted to make about quarterbacks, and I think you could put out any number, but maybe 4 elite quarterbacks, truly elite quarterbacks this year in college football. There's Fields, Lawrence, Tagovailoa, and I'm already forgetting Fields, Lawrence, Tagovailoa, Joe Burrow. That's the name that I didn't say. Those four guys, I think, are all elite in different ways. So when you talk about Lawrence and Burrow, Lawrence is a tall guy that has the ability to point drive the ball anywhere in the field. They'll run little hitch concepts and they'll throw it, but they'll throw it 30 or 40 yards downfield. And Lawrence has incredible ball placement and height on the ball driving it, partly because he's such a tall guy that he can throw it to those tall receivers like it's a comeback or a stop route or a back shoulder throw almost anywhere in the field. It's an almost unique thing that they operate what for most teams is a 10-yard hitch game at the 30 to 40-yard mark. You compare that, though, to a guy like Tua. Tua is a lot more effective, quite frankly, in the short passing game. His anticipation, the smoothness of his release, and the accuracy of ball placement is a little bit better. Lawrence at times has struggled in the short to intermediate game with ball placement, meaning the ability of a receiver to catch it in stride. Tua is next level elite in that regard. In fact, he's probably, you can debate whether or not these guys are all generational passers, and you can make arguments for all of them. But they all are generational in some aspects. Lawrence was generational in his ability to place the ball downfield, in not lobbing it, but actually driving it on a guy. Tua is generational in his ability to place the ball on the run, which you could see with the explosiveness in their passing game, particularly combined with the RPO. Fields was an interesting hybrid because his eliteness came as much from his legs, I think, as his arm. And when you talk about Fields, I flagged he was 0.9 yards per carry. He had been 0.08 yards per carry in the last game against Wisconsin, but he's actually like a 4 yard per carry average guy over the season despite that. He's a very good runner, and it really stresses other teams because you got a guy that's a running back, wide receiver caliber thrower. Quite frankly, I didn't include Hurts in this list. I think Fields is a much better passer than Hurts. I'm not sure that Hurts is a high-level passer at an NFL standard. I think Fields is an NFL-capable thrower. I will be honest, I don't think Fields is the elite pure passer, though, that the other guys are. The final guy I'll note on the list is Burrow. And the trick with Burrow is his ability to deliver the football efficiently and consistently. He makes hot reads. He understands where pressures are coming from. He understands where the open man was. And one of the big things in the Clemson game was there were times when they were in a third and medium or third and long and Fields had the ball where, yes, he made some hero throws, but there were also plenty of times where he took a sack or he threw an ineffective throw. And I would see a guy open on the replay that was quite open in his zone, and he just didn't see him. Burrow's not going to miss him. He has an uncanny ability to realize when he needs to dump it off the back to get his easy 4 yards, to find the open guy in the zone for his 8 to 10 yards. He uses everybody on the field, tight ends, receivers, running backs, and he's an excellent ball distributor. He's a very good passer. He's extremely accurate. He's incredibly accurate on the run, throwing downfield, which you saw in the Oklahoma game. But it's his ability to deliver and distribute the ball that I think separates him and makes him kind of generational compared to the others. So I wanted to set the stage for all that because I think it's important in understanding the matchups to understand that LSU's key and their advantage is efficiency, which you see in our model, and it reflects what Burrow is as a passer, whereas Clemson's real advantage is explosiveness, and that's a reflection of Lawrence.
I do think it's a fair point about quarterbacks, and I do wonder what we would have seen from Ohio State if they could have leveraged the full breadth of their offense and put the pressure on the Clemson defense with Justin Fields running, which would obviously open up throwing a little bit more. I want to talk unit versus unit discussion, and just a little primer. A lot of people, like I said before, or said last week, a lot of people will do like run game versus front seven or pass game versus secondary, but we don't like that as much because you'll have safeties that walk up and that contribute heavily in the run game, or you have people like Chase Young that are going to impact the pass game. So we do run game versus run defense, pass game versus pass defense. I'll start with LSU and let you handle Clemson on the offensive side. LSU's run game versus, or actually I'll do it and then you can give me a quick agree, disagree. That way we can save your vocal cords a little bit. LSU's run game versus Clemson's run defense. I'm going to say that I think LSU is going to struggle here, and a lot of LSU fans are going to point to what J.K. Dobbins did against Clemson, but I would point out that a couple of things here. One, I think J.K. Dobbins is a better pure running back, yards per carry, yards on the ground running back than Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a far better tool in the passing game than J.K. Dobbins is, and he can actually catch, which is important. But also, Dobbins, an elite running back, broke off a couple of big runs because Clemson was walking up a safety, and that's what happens. And we talked about this in the RPO game. When you have everybody dropping back in the RPO game, you have a lot of 10-yard runs, but you don't have a lot of 60-yard runs. Well, we saw him break a couple big because you either stop the run dead in its tracks or you open yourself up to give up a big run. I don't think Clemson's going to struggle as much with big runs in this game, though they might give up a little bit more consistent yardage because they're going to have to play to safety. They're not going to be able to play single high and put a lot of pressure in the box to stop the run. They're just not. So from that standpoint, I think LSU's, we've seen them not be great, not be an elite run team this year. I do think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is healthy-ish, far better than maybe we feared early on. Tell me what you think, agree or disagree, LSU versus Clemson in the run game.
I agree. I think they're going to fight to get to 4 yards per carry. I don't think they're going to get completely shut down. They might even do a little better than the model suggests, but I definitely think it's unrealistic to expect them to be anything really over 5 yards per carry.
All right, so LSU in the pass game versus Clemson's pass defense. I think LSU's passing offense is a shock for anyone. And it's very similar to what I predicted Georgia would struggle with when they played Oklahoma a few years ago against Baker Mayfield. I said Georgia's going to struggle early because seeing that for the first time is just a shock. Seeing these great wide receivers and then bottling them up only to have Clyde Edwards-Helaire come out of the backfield and catch something across the middle for 30 yards, that's a shock. And it's tough to – even if you see it on tape, it's tough to defend. I do think Clemson will adjust over the course of the game, and they'll find some ways to maybe get some pressure on Joe Burrow where Oklahoma couldn't. And that was one of the big problems with Oklahoma is they have a really good inside linebacker. They have a really good defensive lineman, but they don't have much else. So they're not putting pressure on cornerback, and they can't defend the pass. So LSU is going to see a whole different animal in this game. But I still think it's an elite passing offense against a defense that's not as good as last year and can be tested on the edges, can be tested vertically. I don't think this is going to be a 500-yard type game for Burrow, but I do give the advantage to LSU in the passing game. What do you got?
I think the advantage is definitely an LSU in the passing game, and I don't think it's in any way a shot on Clemson. When you're facing a Heisman caliber quarterback, be it a Deshaun Watson or a Joe Burrow, what we've seen consistently in these championship settings is those guys tend to deliver, and they will beat you because an elite, if you've got a Blitnikoff winner at receiver and you've got a Heisman winner at quarterback, there's just only so much you can do. And it's about holding those guys in check. And we talk about it all the time in the model. It's a lot easier to hold teams under the rush average and the passing average, and run average numbers get low. Passing averages numbers never get below 70%. It's just going to be hard to keep LSU from having anything other than an advantage given the weapons they have.
All right, continuing the save Josh's voice train, I'll talk a little more. Clemson running the ball versus LSU's run defense. LSU made a lot of changes after last year to shore up their run D, and it has helped tremendously. But I don't know. Like, I think we talked about this before, and you can tell me where you're leaning. I think that Clemson will struggle running the ball in this game. I think it's fair to include Trevor Lawrence in the run game, though, and we've seen that for whatever reason, maybe it's because people are so worried about the passing game that it does open up Trevor Lawrence to run the ball, and we saw that against Ohio State. Or maybe it's just a good scheme, or he's just that good of a runner, that good of an athlete that he can be effective. I, like you, think Etienne will have a little more success in this game than he has against some other top-notch teams in big games, but I don't think that it's a huge advantage. I'll say this: I would call it the run game. The Clemson run game favors LSU's run defense, unless you count also Trevor Lawrence as a runner. And then I give a slight edge to Clemson. Tell me what you got.
I would tend to agree with it again. Some Clemson fans may not be happy with it. We've harped a couple times on Etienne as a runner. Look, we're not obsessing over it, but we really aren't. But it's pretty notable that Etienne had 36 yards and an 8-yard long running the ball against Ohio State. There was no effectiveness per play with Etienne as a runner, and there was actually no explosive plays with Etienne as a runner in the game. I think they're going to have more success than they did against Ohio State. It's not a particularly high bar, though. And like you said, Lawrence may get a little bit running it. The other thing, I'll kind of factor in on this with LSU's run defense. They gave up some yardage early. Like they gave up 4.3 yards per carry to Vanderbilt, 3.7 in Florida. But they've really shut it down. The end of the season, they were 2.7 yards, 2.7, 2.4, 3.5 against Oklahoma, which actually is very impressive. I think they figured some things out. They were banged up off and on. They didn't have all their pieces. They kind of got them all. And I talked a lot about the fact that Chason was a disappointment as a pass rusher, but Chason has been very effective as a guy setting the edge as an actual true outside linebacker. And I think they've really shifted the way their defense works, and they're using Chason more as a traditional linebacker, and it's really paid dividends in the run game.
And I don't know if it's fair to include Trevor Lawrence, since a lot of his runs are going to come from, yes, some are going to be like design QB draw, but like Joe Burrow for LSU, some of it's just going to come from a 3rd and 7 scramble and get a first down. So I don't know if it's fair either way. Moving on, Clemson's pass offense versus LSU's pass defense. And we saw Texas have a lot of success against LSU. We saw Alabama have a lot of success against LSU passing the ball. I think that Clemson, this is a situation like we said with Oklahoma and CeeDee Lamb. Clemson's going to get theirs, and I would probably give them, again, a slight advantage, not as big of an advantage as LSU's pass game over Clemson's pass defense. I'll give them a slight advantage, but I also think, and I'm going to take one of your talking points that we talked about during the pre-discussion, I think they're going to see that the physicality and the talent at cornerback and safety is something they're not used to. And I think that it's going to really dampen the ability for this Clemson pass game to operate like it's used to. I still give it an advantage because I think Trevor Lawrence is that good. I think these wide receivers are that good. But I don't think the advantage is as big as some people might think, having seen this LSU defense get shredded. Is it fair to even say that this will be close, even though we've seen quarterbacks go for 400 plus multiple times against LSU this year.
I think it's fair. I mean, you stole my talking points. You already know I think it's fair. But the point I was trying to make with it is that Clemson has sort of lived and died. It's not a jump ball. People would say they live and die on the jump ball. That's really not accurate because it's really a drive ball where they're putting the ball on a rope and putting it high enough that the opposing DB can't get to it and that their guy can block it out. And the important thing with it being on a rope is it doesn't give you much time to react to it, to try to get positioning. It really puts you in a disadvantage in that regard because the ball's on you pretty quick, and it's easy for that receiver to kind of block you out, get the pass, and then go, whereas most guys just throw a rainbow and then you're standing in front of each other and one jumps over each other's head. It's a very different thing with a line drive ball than when like you're fielding a punt. Stingley and Fulton are very, very good corners, though, and they're very physical. They're pretty long. I think they're a lot more capable of defending that play. Even then, yes, Ohio State has a great secondary. I don't think Ohio State secondary, to be honest, I don't think their corners are as physical as LSU's. Now, LSU's defense, I will push back a little bit. I think Clemson has an edge because I don't think in the slot LSU's particularly good defensively. I don't think the off safety, off Delpit is whoever rotates in there hasn't really been consistent. Yeah, it's Vincent and Stevens, I think, are the guys that played for the most part. And that's, if I remember correctly, Battle is actually injured or has been injured the whole year. I may be off on that. But the reality for it, I think, is that Clemson's going to get their yards passing, but not maybe in the same way. I think Amari Rodgers is a dark horse to get a lot more yardage than people expect because he will be a mismatch on the slot in a way that he was not against Ohio State, I think. But I do agree with you. I don't think the passing game otherwise is quite the mismatch that Clemson's been used to.
All right, it's time to pick this game. We have talked this out a little bit and a lot of bit, either on this long video or back and forth on Twitter. It's an interesting matchup to me. I loved the Clemson-Ohio State matchup for different reasons in terms of how that game I thought would play out. I think this game is going to be a little bit more of a track meet, which to me is one, it's harder to predict, and it's not as, I hate to say this, but it's not as fun to watch. That Ohio State Clemson game was so much fun to me, and it was so refreshing to see a game that was in the 20s where actual defense was played. I really enjoyed that. One of the things that people aren't talking about is Divinity coming back for LSU. I think it's a big deal that isn't being discussed, and that's why, not just that reason, but the LSU defense is why I'm picking LSU in this game. I think the LSU offense is going to get theirs, and in most cases, the Clemson offense would as well. I don't think that LSU's defense is better than Clemson's defense. I think that LSU's offense is that much better than Clemson's offense in terms of consistency. So give me 37-33 LSU and tell me what you got.
So the first thing I'll correct myself, it was Todd Harris that's out injured, not Battle. I knew that was wrong when I said it, and
Battle was last year.
Yeah, Battle was last year. I knew that was wrong. So I'll give you a stat that to me I think is kind of the interesting hinging point of the game. Against FBS competition, the most yards per attempt that Clemson gave up in a game was 7.6 yards per attempt against Georgia Tech. Now, Georgia Tech's a converted option team, and they kind of were half option in that game. Couldn't throw the ball for crap either, by the way. It was just a couple plays, particularly late. Otherwise, they never gave up over 7 yards per carry in a game. Conversely, the worst game that LSU had in the passing game was 7.6 yards per attempt. So you are in a situation where Clemson's best game, or Clemson's worst game defensively, is LSU's worst game offensively. It's hard to know where the breaking point is there. My inclination is that LSU is going to do better than any team that Clemson's done before. It's reasonable to assert that LSU, who is, their yard per attempt average is literally double Clemson's yard per attempt average allowed. And Ohio State would be their worst day against Clemson. I think they're going to be more in the 8 to 10 yard per attempt range. And especially the second half of the season, they were consistently, even against Georgia, who I think they showed against Baylor is a very good pass defense, 9.2 yards per attempt, 4 touchdowns. I think they're too good. I think LSU is going to be able to get theirs. I have it, I'll say 42-34 LSU. It won't shock me, to be clear, if Clemson wins. I will say it terrifies me to pick LSU, to be honest, because every time I pick LSU, I'm wrong. Every time I pick against Clemson, I'm wrong. Clemson fans love to point that out. Now, it wasn't, as you said, I was wrong last year in the championship, which everybody crows about. I was also right in the playoff game the year prior, which nobody's ever going to mention, but we just kind of mentioned the last data point. I don't know. I mean, my inclination is that the LSU passing game is just a lot more efficient, and that they're not going to stall very much. They're going to be able to continue to work the field, get clutch. Burrow is going to be able to get the convert clutch plays to get them an extra couple scores, maybe to convert in the red zone a little more. Whereas I don't think Clemson's short to intermediate passing game is good enough to get to the upper 30, low 40 range against what I do think is a very good defense.
Yeah, and I think it's fair. I think it's fair to note that Clemson beat Ohio State without 100% quarterback on the other side of the ball. Clemson beat Ohio State without Justin Fields being completely there. And we talked about in the preview, in the review, like what happens if Joe Burrow is on that Ohio State team? And you can talk about how you had injuries on your side of the ball as well, and I think that's a fair counter. But you give up more than 23 points. Like if Ross is all there and you don't have Higgins get hurt early, like, okay, maybe you score another touchdown. Maybe you get 36. You don't get 45. And I wonder, given all those red zone opportunities and the lulls and the mistakes, I wonder if Joe Burrow is that quarterback in that game with the rest of the team for Ohio State if they don't score 40-something. I don't know. Sorry. Josh is coughing off screen. It's contagious. So I don't, and like you, I wouldn't be shocked. I would not be shocked if Clemson won this game. It's a really hard game to predict, given they're different stylistically, and they've just played such different schedules all year. But I picked Clemson to beat Ohio State, and I turned out right. You picked that game to be really close win for Ohio State, and could have been right. This isn't a Clemson bashing thing, and I know Clemson fans will get on us for it. But last year we predicted a pretty comfortable win for Alabama. I don't see that for LSU here, and no outcome except for a blowout on either side. No outcome would surprise me either way. But let's talk about the blowout situation, and then we'll hang up. If this game is 45-20, who's the 45?
I mean, I could sort of see it going either way, but I think it's more likely LSU. There was one game this season against Auburn where LSU was held to 23 points. And in that game, yeah, they were at 7.6 yards per carry, but they still were very effective. They had, I think, over 500 yards of offense. Actually outgained Auburn 2-1, despite only winning by 3. There's a part of me that thinks that the Venables defense could stall LSU in the red zone the way that happened in that game, but there's also a lot of me that says that was probably kind of a one-off weird game that's very unlikely to repeat itself, and that the more likely scenario for a blowout is a situation where LSU jumps on Clemson early, sort of like the start of the Ohio State Clemson game, but instead of being 16-7, it's 28-7. And I think Clemson's in trouble if they're really in catch-up, throw the ball every play mode. I don't think they really want to be off schedule. I just don't think their offense is really built to be off schedule this year. I'll be honest. I disagree with you. It blowout in either direction would not shock me nearly as much as it would you. I think there's a potential for blowouts either way. I think if these teams played 10 times or 20 times, you would get results all over the spectrum. I think you would get blowouts in either side at least once. You'd have close games winning in either way. It's the function of having two very explosive offenses. and defenses that are athletic enough at times to shut down people if they're really really in sync.
For me, I wonder if it's a blowout and the post-mortem is that us saying all year long, y'all, LSU's defense is better than the national narrative. Don't look at just the Ole Miss game. Don't look at the Vandy game, which those were two of those were non-offensive. And look at the personnel, look at the defensive coordinator, look at the scheme. They're better than they're getting credit for. I think the postmortem might be Clemson blew them out, and they tested the same things that Alabama tested. They tested the same things that Texas tested, and that's where we had a blind spot for whatever reason, like we've had before on some things. I think the narrative will be proven out. The national narrative will be proven out if there's a blowout on Clemson's side in this game. I don't see it. I could also see the other situation where we've seen Joe Burrow make these just ridiculous throws all year long that he makes them high percentage on his end, but they're really low percentage throws. Whereas Trevor Lawrence, he's pushing that ball in a back shoulder situation, or like you said, it's not a 50-50 ball because, yes, there might be a defender close to him, but it's something that is on schedule and absolutely part of their offense. I could see that being a little bit of a thing that doesn't happen, doesn't click for Burrow in this game. But we're picking how we're picking. You got 42-34 for LSU. I've got 37-33 for LSU. Neither of us surprised if Clemson wins. Y'all, this has been a wonderful, fun year, and we're not stopping here. There's going to be a lot of off-season content. We promise that every year. We're going to do even more this year. I promise you that, even though some of y'all completely check out come mid-January. We will do a review of this game, and I'm going to try, if Josh can get healthy, to get us on a live show at some point as well. Josh, do you have any parting shots for this game or this season?
Just that I enjoy it. It's been fun to do. It's always fun to mix it up in the comments. We do Twitter at CFB Nerds. That's been a really fun, interesting medium for us to have conversations. And I don't think either one of us is ever afraid to be wrong. And we know we're wrong sometimes. Look, if you're 60% against the spread, you could pretty much move to Vegas and start printing money if you're able to do that on a weekly basis.
Right.
We've, I think, generally been over 50%. I haven't ran the numbers for the season. But we know we're going to be wrong at least 40% of the time. And we know we're going to be wrong about a lot of data points. But we both love college football and we love breaking it down. So it's just fun to talk about.
Yeah, and I pointed out on Twitter today that I am 6-1 in bowls, 5-2 against the spread. I missed the Citrus Bowl by half point, or I would be 6-1 against the spread. You and your Clemson-hating self picking Ohio State hurt you a little bit. We both picked Oregon to win, and they were an underdog, and we both picked Texas to win, and they were an underdog. So that's one of those national narratives that we countered all year, that Texas was actually better than their record or their performance was showing. They had a lot of guys out. That actually paid off in the bowls. I know we touched on that a little bit. But that's it for us. This is a super long one. This has been a lot of fun. I echo what Josh said. I love doing this as well. This is a labor of love. Yes, you will see some ads in there every once in a while from that does support the channel, but man, we love doing this. It's so much fun, and we have as much fun in the comments and on Twitter as we do actually making the videos. So thank y'all for watching so much this year, and we're hoping that 2020 is even better. Please come back. Let us know what you think after the game in our review video. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week.